There is a silent point in every avoidance journey where words no longer bridge the distance, where gestures of love no longer stir emotion, and where the bond you once shared dissolves into something unrecognizable. When that moment arrives, they are not just gone, they are never coming back. Emotional severance in an avoidant individual represents a profound and often silent psychological event that signals an irreversible shift in their relational stance. When an avoidant person begins to detach emotionally, it is not a sudden act of disinterest or impulsive decision-making, but rather the culmination of an inner process where their sense of autonomy has felt repeatedly threatened or compromised. At the core of this severance lies an intricate mechanism of self-preservation, deeply rooted in early attachment patterns and reinforced through life experiences that taught them vulnerability is synonymous with danger. When they reach this threshold, the emotional bond that once tied them to someone is not merely weakened, it is deliberately severed as a means to regain internal equilibrium and safeguard personal freedom. Unlike temporary withdrawal, which may leave the door open for reconciliation, emotional severance signals a finality because the avoidant has psychologically resolved that intimacy with this person is incompatible with their survival instincts. This decision often emerges quietly. There may be no dramatic farewell or confrontation, only a steady retreat into emotional solitude where the avoidant feels safer. Internally, they rationalize this detachment as necessary, convincing themselves that returning to the connection would mean surrendering control and risking emotional engulfment. The act of severance reshapes their mental map of the relationship. Shared memories are reclassified, past affections are reframed as errors of judgment, and any lingering hope of reconnection is consciously extinguished. To an outsider, it may appear as cold indifference, yet beneath the surface lies a disciplined, almost ritualistic process of emotional cutting off designed to prevent future vulnerability. Once this threshold is crossed, even genuine attempts at reconciliation feel invasive to the avoidant, as they perceive such gestures as efforts to dismantle the psychological fortress they've built. In this state, returning is not just unlikely, it is psychologically impossible, because doing so would require the avoidant to dismantle their protective barriers, confront unresolved fears of intimacy, and risk the emotional wounding that they believe detachment has spared them from. Thus, when emotional severance has occurred, it marks not a temporary state, but a transformative turning point, where the avoidant's mind has rewritten its script for connection, replacing closeness with independence and the shared we with a solitary I, making any pathway back to the relationship feel like a betrayal of the very self they fought to preserve. Silent indifference in an avoidant individual is not mere silence or temporary withdrawal. It is the manifestation of a deeper psychological resolution where emotional ties have been dissolved. When an avoidant reaches this state, their lack of response is no longer fueled by anger, confusion, or even avoidance of conflict. It is born out of an internal quietness that signifies closure. This indifference emerges after an extended internal battle, where the avoidant oscillates between longing for connection and fearing the loss of autonomy that intimacy brings. Once they resolve this conflict in favor of self-preservation, they retreat inwardly, and communication ceases not as a tactic, but as a natural expression of emotional detachment. At this stage, words, messages, or attempts to reconnect no longer stir anxiety or guilt within them. These gestures simply pass through without impact because the emotional receptors that once responded to such signals have been deliberately shut down. The avoidant's nervous system, long hyper-alert to perceived intrusions into their space, finds calm in silence, a calm so absolute that even reminders of the past no longer provoke an internal struggle. This psychological quietude is often misunderstood as a waiting game or a temporary freeze, but in reality, it reflects the avoidant's unconscious declaration that the chapter has closed. They may still interact on a surface level if circumstances require, but there is a stark absence of emotional resonance, as though the relationship now exists in a distant, detached dimension of memory. This indifference is self-protective, insulating them from any pull back into vulnerability. They have learned through experience that allowing emotional currents to flow again would risk reopening wounds they believe are safer sealed. In this state, even reconciliation efforts can feel irrelevant or intrusive because the avoidant no longer carries the unresolved tension that might otherwise draw them back. Their internal dialogue has shifted from "should I return?" to "there is nothing to return to," a psychological finality that renders past attachments obsolete. The silence is not meant to punish or manipulate. It is a byproduct of having internally released the connection to preserve their sense of self. To those on the outside, this may feel cold or heartless, but within the avoidant's psyche, it is experienced as peace after long-standing inner conflict. This is why, when silent indifference has taken hold, the avoidant is rarely compelled to revisit the relationship. The emotional energy once invested has been reclaimed and redistributed toward maintaining solitude and safety. Without emotional tension to resolve or desire to rekindle intimacy, there exists no psychological anchor to pull them back, making their absence not just physical but a profound, enduring emotional departure that signals they have moved beyond the possibility of return. Identity reformation in an avoidant individual signifies a psychological transformation where they reconstruct their self-concept in a way that excludes the former relationship entirely, making reconciliation feel not only unnecessary but fundamentally incompatible with who they have become. When avoidants experience relational strain or perceive closeness as threatening, their instinctive response is to protect their autonomy. Over time, if they decide the relationship compromises this independence beyond repair, they begin a subtle yet profound process of redefining themselves. This is not a conscious decision made overnight, but a gradual internal evolution where the avoidant rewrites their narrative to reclaim control over their sense of self. They reinterpret past moments of intimacy as experiences that clouded their judgment or weakened their individuality, thereby reinforcing the belief that separation was essential for self-preservation. As this reformation unfolds, aspects of their former identity tied to the relationship, shared routines, emotional reliance, mutual goals, are systematically stripped away and replaced with new constructs that emphasize self-sufficiency and detachment. This identity shift creates a psychological chasm between their current self and the person they were during the relationship, making the idea of returning feel foreign and even threatening. To re-enter the bond would mean dismantling the new identity they have meticulously built, an act the avoidant perceives as regressing into vulnerability they vowed to escape. This transformation also alters their emotional memory. Moments that once held meaning are reframed as lessons in why closeness must be avoided, and any residual attachment is seen as an obstacle to maintaining their renewed independence. The avoidant begins to associate personal growth and strength with the absence of the former partner, creating a feedback loop where staying away validates their new identity. Even if they encounter situations that remind them of the relationship, they interpret these reminders not as calls to reconnect, but as affirmations of how far they've distanced themselves from that version of life. Externally, this may manifest as significant lifestyle changes, new social circles, or a demeanor that no longer aligns with the shared past. Internally, it feels like a rebirth, one that cannot coexist with the relational patterns they left behind. Because this identity reformation is not a superficial adjustment but a deep psychological restructuring, attempts to reconcile are often met with resistance or emotional numbness. The avoidant is not merely unwilling to return, they perceive themselves as fundamentally incapable of fitting back into a relationship dynamic that contradicts their self-concept. To reconnect would not only challenge their autonomy, but also dismantle the fragile yet fiercely protected identity they believe safeguards their emotional survival. This is why, once this transformation is complete, the possibility of reconciliation diminishes almost entirely. The person who was once attached to the relationship no longer exists in the same form, leaving nothing familiar to return to. Attachment deactivation in an avoidant individual represents a deep psychological mechanism that allows them to shut down emotional bonds when intimacy begins to feel overwhelming or threatening to their independence. This process is not deliberate in the way a decision is made. Rather, it is an ingrained survival strategy shaped by early relational experiences where vulnerability was met with discomfort, rejection, or emotional unpredictability. When an avoidant senses that closeness may lead to losing their sense of self, they instinctively activate this internal switch that deactivates attachment needs. Unlike momentary withdrawal, which may still leave emotional ties intact, full deactivation severs the emotional tether completely, creating a state of emotional numbness toward the partner. In this state, memories of affection, shared moments, and even unresolved conflicts lose their emotional weight, as though they belong to a different life. The avoidant psyche accomplishes this by suppressing feelings of longing, minimizing the importance of the bond, and mentally reframing the relationship as something that no longer contributes to their well-being. This suppression is often reinforced through rationalizations. They convince themselves that intimacy is dangerous, dependence is weakness, and solitude is freedom. The deeper this deactivation becomes, the less capable they are of experiencing the natural pull that typically brings individuals back to loved ones after distance or conflict. The nervous system itself adapts to maintain this state. Emotional triggers that once evoked connection now provoke discomfort, pushing the avoidant further into detachment. Because of this rewiring, attempts to rekindle closeness feel unnatural, even suffocating, as if they violate the internal balance the avoidant has fought to restore. To return to the relationship would require them to reverse this deactivation process, confronting fears of engulfment and reopening the vulnerability they work to shut down, which for most avoidants feels psychologically unsafe. Over time, this mechanism becomes self-reinforcing. The longer the attachment system remains inactive, the more foreign intimacy feels, and the more distant the past connection becomes. This detachment is often mistaken for healing or moving on, but in reality, it is a defensive state designed to ensure the avoidant never feels trapped again. From the outside, this can appear as cold finality, no emotional reactions, no visible signs of pain, just an unyielding quiet that signals they have psychologically locked the door. Inside, however, it is an intricate system of emotional self-protection that cannot be undone simply by gestures of reconciliation or reminders of past love. Once attachment has been fully deactivated, there is no internal force strong enough to pull them back into the relationship because the very mechanism that binds humans to one another has been switched off. This is why, when an avoidant reaches this depth of detachment, they rarely, if ever, return. To do so would mean dismantling the psychological shield that they believe keeps them safe from losing themselves in closeness again. Projection of finality in an avoidant individual is a subtle yet powerful psychological signal that indicates they have reached a state of closure that is unlikely to be reversed. This projection does not arise from a sudden decision, but from a gradual internal process in which the avoidant mentally and emotionally concludes that the relationship no longer holds a place in their life. It often manifests through concrete, observable actions such as discarding shared possessions, removing reminders of the partner, avoiding mutual social spaces, or even changing routines to ensure there is no intersection with the past connection. These actions are not impulsive reactions to conflict. They are deliberate steps toward solidifying emotional distance and reinforcing the belief that the relationship is permanently over. Psychologically, these gestures serve as external affirmations of an internal state where returning is not only undesired, but seen as incompatible with the person they have chosen to become. The avoidant begins to re-script their life narrative, placing the former relationship as a closed chapter that contributed to their understanding of themselves, but holds no role in their envisioned future. This projection of permanence also stems from the avoidant's need to maintain psychological safety. By physically and emotionally erasing traces of the relationship, they eliminate triggers that might otherwise reignite attachment feelings or doubts about their decision. This self-protective measure ensures they do not face the internal conflict of longing versus fear of intimacy again. As these behaviors accumulate, they create an emotional point of no return, where even imagining reconciliation feels foreign and uncomfortable. The avoidance mind associates finality with freedom, and any thought of returning feels like a betrayal of the independence they have worked to secure. This projection often extends into their interactions with others. They may speak of the past connection with detachment or avoid discussing it entirely, signaling that it no longer occupies mental or emotional space. To outsiders, this may appear as a coping mechanism or temporary avoidance, but within the avoidance psyche, it reflects a deep commitment to moving forward without revisiting what they left behind. Because this projection is not superficial but tied to a reconstructed sense of self and safety, attempts to reignite the relationship face an invisible barrier. The avoidant has not simply walked away. They have psychologically sealed the pathway back, reinforcing it with every act of letting go and every step taken into a life designed to exclude that past bond. When this finality has been fully projected, the possibility of return diminishes to near impossibility, because doing so would mean unraveling the psychological closure they fought to establish and stepping back into vulnerability they have vowed never to experience again. When emotional severance has occurred, silence has turned to indifference. Identity has been rebuilt without you, attachment has been fully deactivated, and every action projects a finality that cannot be undone. It signals more than just a breakup. It marks a psychological rebirth within the avoidant. In this rebirth, returning would mean tearing down the walls they built for survival, dismantling the independence they fought to reclaim, and stepping back into vulnerability they believe nearly destroyed them. This is why, once these signs manifest, hope for their return fades into impossibility. They are not lost temporarily. They have crossed a threshold where the past can no longer reach them, and the future they've chosen no longer has a place for what once was.